He was not the kind of man who lost control easily. His world was measured in ledgers and contracts, in columns of numbers that always balanced, no matter how turbulent the markets turned. But one night, as the rain fell over the city's glass towers, the man who had once believed in the sanctity of wealth struck a single match and watched his empire begin to glow. The flames rose softly at first, the color of gold, the very hue he had worshipped for decades, and in that trembling light he saw what he had built, not an empire of creation but of faith, paper, and illusion. Every note that curled and blackened was a confession, every spark a sermon. He realized that money had never been real, only belief made it so. Belief shared by millions who had never touched the gold beneath. The banks, the markets, the currency, all of it rested on a single fragile promise that people would keep believing tomorrow. And yet, here he stood, disproving it in the most absolute way a man could. This was not madness, it was a revelation. Because behind every economy, every empire, every so-called system of value, lies a religion that asks for devotion but never proof. He had given that devotion all his life, rising through marble halls where portraits of old financiers watched from the walls, men who had turned debt into dominion, paper into power. They called it growth, innovation, and progress. But to him it had become worship without meaning, an altar built on nothing but collective faith. So he lit the flame not to destroy, but to expose, to turn belief into light. Outside his window, the skyline pulsed blue and cold, its glass reflecting the distant fires of a world obsessed with more. Inside, the color shifted, from the sterile white of fluorescent wealth to the deep red of something human, something final. The smell of burning ink filled the air like incense. It was his last audit, one that required no numbers, only truth. The papers twisted, the coins hissed, and for the first time in his life, he felt rich, not in possession, but in clarity. He had discovered that the real worth of a fortune is not in what it can buy, but in whether it can be surrendered. And as the last note turned to ash, he whispered the only balance sheet that mattered: belief on one side, freedom on the other. The flame had consumed his wealth, but it had also revealed the thing that had ruled him all along, faith disguised as finance. And when the smoke cleared, he saw what no prophet could ever show, that to own the system, one must first dare to let it burn. Long before the match was struck, the machinery he chose to confront had already written his destiny. The modern banking world was not born in chaos. It was engineered in precision, layered like a cathedral of contracts, where every promise fed another, and every signature carried the illusion of permanence. Inside this architecture of belief, he had built his empire, a system so vast that its power was invisible, flowing through screens, interest rates, and coded language that only the initiated could read. He knew how the world's heartbeat was tied to debt, how nations borrowed faith the way men borrowed time, and how the invisible gears of finance turned not by labor, but by trust. Yet behind every screen, behind every transaction, he had begun to see the emptiness of what he once called progress. Money no longer represented effort or creation, it represented obedience. The system rewarded not value, but control. It could inflate hope, collapse futures, and declare fortunes vanished overnight, not through battle or disaster, but through numbers rearranged on a screen. And still, people called it order. He had watched nations dance to interest rates, watched leaders speak of growth while their citizens sank deeper into invisible chains. In boardrooms of polished stone and glass, he heard men speak of liquidity and leverage with the reverence once reserved for gods. To question it was heresy, to doubt it was treason. So when he chose to destroy his wealth, it was not an act of madness, it was a rebellion against the church of modern economics. The same system that claimed to measure value could not measure truth. It could predict returns, but not regret. It could project growth, but not guilt. And within that paradox, he saw his reflection, a man who had mastered the illusion, but lost his own meaning within it. As the story of his burning spread, the institutions he once served called him unstable. Reporters framed it as tragedy, a rich man undone by conscience. But quietly, among those who understood how the system fed upon faith, there was something like awe. He had shown them what few dared to admit, that currency is not backed by gold or government or productivity, it is backed by confidence. Remove the confidence, and even the richest nation stands naked. The act of burning his fortune became more than protest, it became a mirror held up to the empire itself. His wealth had vanished in minutes, yet the markets barely flinched, proof that even immense individual power meant nothing before the collective machinery of belief. In that silence, the truth echoed louder than any speech. The banker who had once controlled capital had discovered the only way to defeat it, by rejecting its language. He had turned the system's greatest weapon, money, against itself, and though the flames had faded, their reflection lingered in the glass towers of every financial district. Behind the blue glow of screens, traders hesitated for just a moment longer before pressing buy. Investors spoke softer about certainty. Somewhere, deep inside the vaults of the global mind, a small question had been planted. What if value was never real? He had not escaped the system, he had exposed its soul. His act did not end capitalism, or debt, or trade, but it stripped the illusion of invincibility that kept them sacred, because every empire, no matter how sophisticated, rests upon a story it tells about itself. And when one man dared to burn the story's pages, he forced the world to read the blank space beneath. In that silence, the myth of control flickered, just for a moment, and the blue light of the system dimmed. In the days that followed, his act became legend, debated in financial journals, condemned in newsrooms, whispered about in the marble corridors where power still counted its coins. Some called it insanity, others called it art. But those who looked closer saw it for what it was, a message written in smoke, a quiet sermon about value and faith. The banker had disappeared from the skyline he once helped build. The charred remains of his fortune were gathered by curious officials, sealed in transparent cases, displayed like relics of a lost religion. The markets carried on, charts climbed, reports circulated, currencies traded, yet something had changed in the rhythm of the world's transactions. Beneath the blue glow of digital numbers, there was now the faint smell of ash. Traders spoke his name without emotion, but deep down they feared the question he had left behind. What happens to a system when one believer stops believing? The world tried to forget him, as it always does. The headlines moved on, the outrage cooled, and the empire continued its calculations. But in the quiet corners of finance, among young analysts who stared too long at their screens, his story became a warning. He had proved that the system's power was psychological, not structural. The architecture of money was not made of steel or code, it was made of trust, and trust could burn. His rebellion revealed that collapse need not come from crisis or invasion, it could come from disillusionment, from a slow erosion of faith. When belief weakens, economies tremble. When meaning fades, even numbers lose their value. And in that truth, his ashes spoke louder than his wealth ever did. In the years that followed, replicas of his act appeared across the world. Small, silent protests, artists burning contracts, citizens shredding debt notes, symbolic flames flickering across screens. They were not destroying wealth, they were reclaiming meaning. His defiance had become metaphor, a reminder that real power lies not in creation or possession, but in refusal. Economists tried to rationalize him, philosophers tried to define him, and politicians tried to erase him, but his lesson remained. When a man sets fire to his fortune, the question is not why he did it, the question is why others never dare to. As the decades turned, his name was absorbed into myth. Some said he fled to the mountains, others that he died watching the markets recover. But his story survived because it revealed something timeless, that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are built on fragile stories of belief. Gold once held faith, then paper, then pixels, yet the ritual never changed. People still knelt before value, as if it were divine. He had shown that by burning wealth, one does not end the illusion, one simply exposes its fragility. Tonight, the city still glows blue and golden under its artificial sky. In its towers, new bankers speak the same language of confidence, the same promises of infinite growth. Yet somewhere within that endless hum of trade, a quiet memory lingers, of the man who broke the ritual. The world pretends not to remember, but the ripple remains. Because meaning, once questioned, never returns unchanged. His act became more than defiance, it became a prophecy, that one day, the system built on faith will face its own fire, and every screen that once glowed with numbers will reflect what he saw in the flame, the truth that value was never wealth, it was belief, borrowed and returned. And as the night swallows the skyline once more, the faint scent of smoke still drifts through the empire of glass, reminding us that even in a world of infinite credit, faith remains the last currency.